we are officially live. Come on in when you're ready. Welcome to the Q&A. A little lead-in music. Not a bad idea. Kind of gets me in the mood to the thing. Welcome to Q&A. Hey, Carl. Good to see you're here. I owe you a message. You pinged me a little while ago. I've not hit you back. A few questions about comics. We'll get into that. I actually might thank you, Carl. I appreciate that. Little homage to our good buddy Charlie over at Emergency Awesome. Thank you, Eric. I love the shirt as well. It's one of my favorites. iStone Rock is here. Hey, Sony. Hey, I'm gonna jump in with a few quick announcements. Thank you, Carl, for the grace. Appreciate it. About things that are coming up, and I'll reiterate these at the end of the broadcast, so that you're not going to miss anything. First announcement has to do with the podcast. The At Sea podcast season 2 launches really soon. We're right on the edge of of putting stuff into the internet. So the bottom line with a little bit of the delay here, I was hoping to get things up in February, is we wanted to have a few extra things lined up. We didn't want to just kind of take off without having I don't know, quite a few ducks in a row. I like to have ducks in rows, as it were. So here's what I can tell you right now about season 2 of the At Sea podcast. This is right now the lineup of guests that we've got, and we've got locked in. About half these folks are already we've recorded the conversations already. We're in the editing process. But Mark Labberton, who's the president of Fuller Theological Seminary, a tremendous author, a brilliant mind, propaganda hip-hop artist, poet. You're going to love him. Elizabeth Wilkinson is a journalist and a writer over at Vox. She's got a ton to say about not just a film, which is where she spends most of her time, but about culture and conversation and the way we use Facebook to collide with one another. David Dark, one of my favorite authors. If you haven't read The Sacredness of Questioning Everything, or his most recent book, Life's Too Short to Pretend You're Not Religious, it's a really great book. He's great. This is a great conversation. Sandra McCracken, tremendous singer-songwriter. Ryan O'Neal, another great songwriter. Sleeping at Last is the name of the band. If you watch like Grey's Anatomy, really if you watch television after 8 p.m., you've probably heard Ryan's work. Audrey Assad, another tremendous songwriter. This is just what we've got like locked in. Most of it recorded already. And beyond this, there are a number of folks that we're in conversation with. It's going to be a really fun season 2. More than fun, I think it's going to be a great season 2. It will be, in fact, huge. Saw that coming. I'm sure you saw that coming. Other announcement that I'm gonna that I'll reiterate later on is in the next few weeks. That I've been planning for this for a long time. This is about to happen. I'm going to after 17 and a half years of making art. And making music and working on the business side of things, I have put together a 20-chapter, 20-lesson online course on creativity. But broader than just creativity, in all honesty, the course, Learning to Make Your Best Work, it really will be about this sort of intersection of faith and identity and creativity. What I want to focus on is who you are in what you make is actually more important than what you make. So that will be launching in the next, in the foreseeable future is what I'll say. And we're going to make it super affordable if you can come in because what's important is what you're making and not what I'm making off what you're making. I'm excited about the online course. So, like I said, this is a Q&A, and I've got a few great questions that came in from folks, and I'm gonna go to the list here. These are some of the questions that came in earlier. Feel free, as we're going along, if you've got questions you want to drop, you can drop those questions right here. I'll do my best to pick them up as I go. So, first question off the top here from last time, actually, Destiny wrote, how do you stay artistically true to yourself while also considering your audience. And I love the question. I think there's a little bit of a seed in there that presents something of a false choice, that there is a competition somehow between being true to myself and considering the people who will consume or enjoy or take part of what I'm making. So I'll dig into it maybe a little more in a complex way. I think there's a season, especially early on, maybe a long season, in which I need to, the phrase people use, find my own voice and figure out how I'm supposed to make things. Over the course of time, though, the more comfortable I am with who I am and what I'm making, it's impossible to not consider other people in what I'm making. It's impossible to do that. To just kind of be me in a corner creating whatever I'm creating. If that's the emphasis, then that's journaling. So if I'm making music and I'm not really thinking about someone else, I'm thinking that's more like journaling than it is like art. Art has to do with connection. Art is anything I create, anything we create that facilitates human connection. So there almost always has to be someone on the other side of that. So as I grow more confident in who I am as a person and as an artist, then I grow more aware of the people who will take in, consume, listen, be blessed by, be moved by what I make. And so I would actually say it like this, that being true to myself as an artist over the course of time means learning to consider other people. Being true to myself as an artist actually does mean thinking about the people who are going to receive what I'm making. Now, that doesn't mean I'm waiting for permission from other folks to create things, or I'm taking polls about what to create, but I am considering the impact that my work's going to make. So the way that plays out in my life is I make what I make, yes, because it's in me and because I love creating. But I make it available to people because I'm trying to love my world well. And the older I get, the more mature I get as a person, little bit mature, the more mature I get as an artist, the more I'm able to see those things as kind of, they're not even two things. There's maybe two movements out of the same place. What I'm creating and who I'm creating it for, that's actually how I remain true. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. That's actually something I'll go after in the online course that we're launching in a few weeks. That's a great question. Thank you for bringing it to the table. Another question that came in earlier, can you talk about your thoughts behind the lyrics in the song, I Know You're That Way Too? So, this is from Brad. Brad was asking about a specific set of lyrics in the song, I Know You're That Way Too. That's a song that's from an EP I released last year called Everything Has Changed. The song itself, actually I'll go meta here. The EP, Everything Has Changed, is written through like a relatively strange and difficult season of watching a ton of stuff around me move that I didn't expect to move. Relationships change that I didn't expect to change. And the decision I made in that season to be someone who didn't move when the tide moved. That as things kind of spin out of control around me, one of the choices I can make, because I can't always control the world around me as much as I'd like to, is I can control how my own feet are planted. And I wanted to present myself as someone in relationship to another person, and I'll talk about that person here in a second, as someone in relationship to someone else who is steady, who is faithful, who I'm not moving. It was sort of in general as a song, a way to say, like, there's a lot happening for you, and I'm gonna be here regardless. The specific line you're talking about really has to do with dual nature. That in the Christian tradition, my religious tradition, we tend to talk about my good side and my bad side. We'll say like my sin nature and my redeemed nature. And I think that language can be helpful up to a point. I do think that at some point, how should I say this? In some seasons or over the course of time, I have to begin to embrace myself as a whole person rather than think of myself as this divided person where I've got like my good side and my bad side. So like, am I a bad guy who has some good moments, or am I a good guy who has some bad moments? I'm human. I'm a person, and I've got all this stuff happening sort of at the same time. And I think it can be unhelpful to try to divide myself into like my good side, my bad side, my dark side, my light side, and instead like embrace the sort of mess that is me, and just dive into life and do the best I can, and love as best I can, and as whole as I can, and let the rest of it kind of get worked out in grace and in history. So the song ends up being me trying to present that to someone else, saying like, hey man, you're both of these things. Like you are your bad history, and you are your better choices. But because you're both things, all that means is it just makes you human, which puts you in the same boat as everyone else. That's kind of where the song was coming from. Thanks for the question, Brad. Thanks, Carl. Good to see you. Hey, Jennifer. Glad you're here. Another question here from Lindsay. What are you reading right now? So I got this enough time to grab a couple books. There are, I'm going to come back to that question in a second here. There are a few that I'm into right now. I just actually picked this up, and you can't read it because it's backwards. It's not backwards. The internet is backwards. This is Ephraim Smith's new book. Ephraim is a pastor, teacher, actually lives in Sacramento. It's not too far from where I am. And it's a book that I've heard a ton about. Obviously, it's called Killing Us Softly. That is, it's angled at the sacrificial nature of doing good work in the world. In other words, the way we go about living in relationship to one another. That if I'm not being forced into change or crisis, I might not be living a whole and full life. So I'm happy to dig into this. So the other thing I'm digging into, speaking of sacrifice and living a great life, is this incredible box set. Maybe some of you might have this, but Senator John Lewis. It's a biography, in essence, his experience, part of the civil rights movement, and specifically the Martin Selma, and some of the key moments in the civil rights history that have to do with John Lewis. It is a 3-volume set. I'm going to show you a couple of these, and it's gorgeous. It is a graphic novel. There's volumes 1, 2, and 3. This thing, as a graphic novel, and I love this. This thing won a National Book Award. Outside of the fact that I just love seeing comics win awards, which is just tremendous. It really, as a story, is a beautiful, beautiful story. It's done well. It's drawn well. The inking is incredible. Like if you've got time and space in your life, you want to dive into this. And if this is, by the way, if you're not someone who reads graphic novels, this is a great entrance into the world of graphic novels to figure out how powerful these things can be. One of my favorite writers is a guy named Gene Yang, who's a guest on season 1 of the At Sea podcast. His work is actually somewhat similar to this insofar as it approaches issues of racial reconciliation and sort of the difficulties of American history, and does so with sort of a dramatic flair without being over the top. It's anyway. So Gene Yang's another person to go to if you're looking for a graphic novel, trying to figure out a way to get in. Hey Nick, good to see you. Jackie here, fantastic. Glad you're here. Another question from Janet. Oh, that's interesting. Why have you been more vocal about politics recently? Here's the thing. I don't think I've ever been maybe as publicly conversational about politics, and not even because I think this is a time that matters more than other times. I think maybe it's this, that I've learned to recognize that when we talk about politics, it's just another way to talk about being a neighbor. And over the course of my years as a pastor in my own community and a traveling speaker, teacher, music person, I've grown disillusioned with the sort of the line between politics and everything else. That we can somehow talk about politics over here or keep politics in a corner. Politics is really just a way to talk about how we behave with one another. How do I love well the people around me? That's a political question. And yeah, it gets messy and weird, but I would say it like this: if I'm hung up or if I'm nervous about getting into politics because it's messy and weird, man, that just has more to do. People are messy and weird, and there's conflict. And so I've tried to be more vocal about politics because for me, politics is a matter of spiritual formation. I'm more concerned about the posture we're taking than the positions we're taking. You and I will probably have vastly different positions on things, but we also live in the same world, online and otherwise. And how we relate with one another, man, like that's a key issue. Like that's a human issue. So as a spiritual director type person, as a pastor, as an artist, it actually matters. Politics matters to me because it's about human relationship. And as an artist, maybe that's the way to say it. As an artist, if I'm about human connection, then I'm about politics, whether I like it or not. During the conversation I had, which you'll hear soon with Audrey Assad, who's one of our guests for season 2 of the At Sea podcast, we talk about this I don't know, this sort of unfortunate division that folks want to separate and say, like, they don't want artists to get involved with politics. That, like, hey, stick with music or stick with TV or stick with whatever. And I think that's a way of saying I want to like you, but not have to deal with the fact that you have different ideas than I do. And that's just an inhuman way to go about living in the world. The artists you listen to will have different perspectives on how to live as a neighbor. That's just true. And that means that you and I have to deal with the artists we listen to, the people whose work we're consuming on a human level. So why am I more involved in politics now than I was before, or at least talk about it more? Because I think it matters, and I want to help in that space. So a couple more things. I've got a question here. Actually, a really interesting question. Trevor asks about creative process. He says, what normally comes first in your writing process? Most of the time, I mentioned this before, I actually don't have a notebook on me, which is a bad example, but I almost always have this little notebook on me, and that's the place where almost all my creative ideas start, is actually in this little notebook. It's sort of the landing place. Is it lyrics first? Is it music first? You know, the cheesy answer is to say, like, oh, it really depends on the song. The reality is, there really is kind of a, maybe not a standardized path, but a pretty regular path. It always, for me, almost always begins with a general sense of what I want to say. That there's something I want to communicate. I'm moved by something, or I'm irritated by something, and I want to get in on that conversation. Because what I'm trying to do is provide language and shape for the process of life and faith. So it's a sort of general concept. Something moves me to want to create. The next thing that happens is I'll normally find a phrase. So when we talk about, like, is it lyrics first or music first? In songwriting, it's, for me, it really is almost always there's like a set of words, a phrase, an idea in word that kickstarts the whole thing, and that's obviously true with book writing as well. But it almost always begins with like a singular phrase or a word or a concept, like this, enough that I could write it down in, like a tweetable size. From there, in song, I sort of chase a melody that sits well with the idea, with the image. And then, that's where the ride really begins. Because once the melody gets involved, at least in song, it ends up sometimes changing that phrase, and then the phrase kind of redictates the melody, and we're sort of on this roller coaster ride. And by the end of, like, a song, that phrase might be different, the melody might be completely different than it was before, but it almost always begins with, like a thought in my mind, like a general concept, something I want to get involved in, and then a phrase that captures that at least decently as a launching point. That's usually how it starts. Nick, when are you coming back to Cornerstone? I don't know, man. I would love to. It's been a long time since I saw you. Morgan Stone is here. Hey, Morgan. Glad you're here. If you got any more questions, by the way, go ahead and throw them up on the thread here. I'm going to go back and try to find this question. Michael Gilbert says, how do you go about looking back at old projects that you've never released? Do you change them to accommodate the season, or try to keep it in original to the season you were in? Oh, interesting. You know, I definitely keep old stuff. I keep bad work. I keep stuff that doesn't fly. And what I'll say is this: if I've written something, I put something down, and I don't release it in that season, it almost never then comes out the way it was originally written. And normally it ends up being kind of this like Frankenstein body part that that belongs to something I make in the future. So one of the advice I give, the pieces of advice I give to creators is to keep all your bad stuff. Like, keep a log of everything you've created, even if you hate it, for a couple reasons. One, you might be wrong. You might be wrong about how bad it is. It might not actually be that bad. Maybe more importantly than that, the quality of something, whether something's good or bad, is almost always a matter of context. So if a lyric sucks, it probably has more to do with the relationship, with that lyric's relationship with the words around it. If it's a bad color in relationship to what? The colors around it, right? So sometimes, if not always, a bad project or a bad song or a bad lyric, like bad work, is a matter of context. And so taking pieces of that, having that available, I get to plug that into newer pieces. So it'll work like this. I'll be working on a new project, a new song, a new book, and I'll get hung up somewhere. I won't have words for what's next. And what I get to do is reach back into an old binder or an old, lyric sheet, or like an old music file, and find older work and kind of sift through there to see if there's actually something in there that would potentially work for that space. Man, honestly, I'm going to say 50 to 60% of the time, if I'm hung up on something new, something I created back in the day that I thought sucked ends up being really helpful for today. So I almost never release something, as it was written, but I almost always end up using it in some way, shape, or form. Tim, I have almost 2 terabytes of bad stuff. Well, you've got tons of room to work with. You've got stuff that you can build off of. That's really good. Sometimes it's good. Yes. It is good when your perspective changes. And there was a question here, Nikki Pruitt. When and how do you decide to invite someone else into the writing and creating process? Man. That really depends on the person. B, how should I say this? It's a really emotional question. So there are things that I have to come to a place of comfort first. I have to be okay with where the project is, or where I am, before I can make that available to someone else. So there isn't a line that I normally cross. Here's what I've come to. I've made enough work over the course of years that I care less about. I'm less embarrassed. I'll say I'm less embarrassed at not having something great up front, and so I'm freer now to share work earlier with people. That is predicated on this. There's a really short list of people who get to be involved in that process, if that makes some sense. People I trust, not just in their perspective, but because they understand what it is that I'm up to. So maybe that's kind of the twofold question. The first question is who are we really talking about? What person, and what angle do they have in your life? What kind of perspective do they have on who you are? And once I've got that list, then sort of the emotional part of letting someone in on your work, good or bad, it almost actually kind of settles itself. Giuseppe Ciccone asks, how do you make the time to write and maintain the rhythm of life? Bro, calendar is your friend. Blocking that time out, having a calendar. At some point what I'll do is I'll take you on a little tour of my creative space. One of the things that is over there, that is maybe the most important tool I have in my creative tool belt, is the calendar. And on the calendar I have mapped my seasons out. And not only just the seasons, but also the days. So right now, my Tuesdays and Thursdays, almost across the board, they're creative days. And I've got that stuff blocked out. My wife and I are in agreement. This is time when I'm creating. She knows obviously that's important. And so there isn't a conflict unless I put it there. I block that time out. I set it aside and say, this is the time I am making work. So your calendar, telling your calendar when you're working. Otherwise, your calendar will tell you when you're working, which is never. If I wait until I have inspired space in order to create, man, I'm never getting that. It just doesn't happen. So I have to tell my calendar, like, this is when I'm going, and then the other part of that is I have to stick with that, to stick with the plan. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. So the calendar is your best tool, but once you have that tool, you still have to use it, which ends up being a matter of work and work ethic, which then brings me to this. And this is a really long answer to that question, Giuseppe, but if I'm having a hard time, like, sticking with my commitment to create something and to stay focused on that creative project, I've really got to start asking questions about how serious I am about it, if that makes some sense. Like, that's, if I have to make it, like, then I will create the time and stick with it. Like, if it's in me and I've got to get it out, then I'll create the time and I'll make it. But if it's something I'm kind of meh about, then, you know, honestly, maybe I should be paying attention to other things. So there's sort of a long, convoluted answer to that. Stick with the have a calendar, stick with your commitments, but then pay attention to how serious you are about the actual creative project. I've got a couple minutes here before I need to cut. Any other questions I've got? Oh, you're welcome. Hey, look, Chris is here. I'm glad you're here. How do you maintain the rhythm of life? Stan Friedman, on your creative projects, whether song or book, how do you know when you're done? It's time to be done with the mix, etc. How do you know you're done? Finishing. So that can be super difficult. I'm never done. Like, I'm never finished. There's one answer to that question is I'm never finished. I can always make something better. I can always keep tweaking. And so being done is almost always, for me, a matter of will. I decide. I'm finished. Sometimes that comes with setting the time, sort of the time parameters, which, again, that comes back to my calendar over there, that, like, there's a season in which I give myself a month and a half, or give myself 2 months, or give myself 2 weeks. Here's the time I'm allotting for this. And at the end of that time, I'm finished because that's the time I gave myself. Sometimes that's a matter of, like, I've crossed a few deadlines and I have to decide when I'm finished because I need to move on to other things. But regardless of how that works, it's almost always a matter of will. I choose to be finished. So setting a budget, saying I'm going to spend this much time, I'm going to spend this much money, that tends to dictate my finishedness. I decide when I'm done. Hopefully that's helpful. Any last minute questions here before I move on? Hey, Courtney is here. Glad you're here, Court. Good to see you. Bonnie Lang is here from Canada. Again, our Canadian friends. And now we're international again. It's an international broadcast. So back to those announcements. If you were not here earlier, the one, and I dropped it here, so I'm going to bow out for just a second and bring it back. The one is Season 2 of the At Sea podcast begins very, very soon. Here is that list of guests. You're quite welcome, Stan. This is the list of guests that we already have locked in, and there will be several more guests that we'll be announcing over the course of time. But get excited about these guests. Some great conversations. Most of the stuff's already recorded. The other announcement is in the next few weeks, I'll be releasing, it's kind of my major release for the year, to be honest with you, this online creativity course called Learning to Make Your Best Work. That after 17 years of creating art, I've learned a few things about what it looks like to not be successful, but not in the terms of, like, selling. What's it look like to be successful as an artist, as a creative? What does it take to overcome obstacles? And more importantly, like, focusing on who we are as humans, and what our creative process adds to that and draws out of us in it. So those are two massive announcements. Thank you for your time here. Obviously, we're going to archive this, and what I'm probably going to start doing is actually, once I've finished these, pull them down, and I'll actually may start uploading them to YouTube for more sort of easier access. Thank you guys for your time. I will see you probably another 2 weeks.